of Rob Porter's former wives have spoken to the media and alleged that he was abusive toward them. Of course, Rob Porter is now a former White House aide. He was actually the staff secretary, and he worked very closely with John Kelly in the Trump administration. But following these allegations, he did decide to step down, and we have the details of what was alleged against him. Now, Rob Porter, a top aide to President Donald Trump, physically assaulted both of his previous wives, according to the two women. Porter's first wife said she was physically abused for years, providing a photograph she took of herself after she said Porter hit her while on vacation in Florence, Italy, a photo she also shared with the FBI. And this is reporting by The Intercept, but the story was originally broken, the Daily Mail originally broke the story. So his first wife is Colby Holderness, and we're about to show you the photo that she provided as evidence of the abuse that she faced while she was with Rob Porter. Here it is. So you can see that she has a black eye.
So let me give 2 pieces of context here. First of all, Rob Porter's job was incredibly important. He's the one who determined what went on Trump's desk and what didn't. Now, in the old days when Steve Bannon and that circus was in town, they would slip in all sorts of articles from extreme right-wing websites that had no credibility at all, and then Trump would start tweeting about it and it would affect US policy. John Kelly basically put an end to that and actually tried to put mainly facts on his desk. And the guy who was supposed to do that was Rob Porter. So that is why the lunatics in the White House don't like Rob Porter, and they want to be able to put whatever their agenda is on Trump's desk. And Rob Porter also helped to write part of the State of the Union. He was an integral part of Trump's White House. Now, the fact that even crazier people don't like him doesn't mean he didn't do it, okay? And there is a lot of evidence here. Now, he says he didn't do it, all these charges are false, and he says that picture had nothing to do with him hitting his wife, it was about something else, and that he's the one who took the picture. Now, a lot of Republican senators, or at least one Republican senator, Orrin Hatch, believes him. John Kelly, the chief of staff, believes him, and they've gotten themselves in significant trouble for saying so. But Anna's got more evidence of what he might have done, and it's not just his 2 wives, but also the woman he was dating after the 2 wives as well.
So we'll get to that in just a minute. But Colby Holderness continued to tell The Intercept, he only punched me once in the eye. He threw me down on the bed and punched me in the face. I think he was shocked that he had just lost control to that extent. She also talked about what the relationship was like throughout the marriage. Up until then, he had always done it in a way that didn't leave marks. I don't know if that was conscious or not. He would get angry and throw me down on a soft surface. To his credit, it was always a soft surface like a couch or a bed. And he would lay on top of me, shaking me or rubbing an elbow or a knee into me. He graduated to choking me, not ever hard enough to make me pass out or frankly to leave marks, but it was frightening and dehumanizing. Her accusations are a little more severe than his second wife. His second wife said that he had gotten physical with her once after they were arguing with one another. She left to go take a shower, and he essentially dragged her out of the shower and physically forced her to continue arguing with him. But she said, the second wife, that he was certainly emotionally abusive, and we're gonna hear from her now. She actually wrote a blog post about her relationship with Rob Porter last year, but she didn't name who he was. Now, reporters did some digging, they found that blog post, and they essentially confronted his second wife about it, and she did confirm that she was in fact writing about Rob Porter. Now, here's what she had said. The first time he called me fucking bitch was on our honeymoon. A month later, he physically prevented me from leaving the house. Less than 2 months after that, I filed a protective order with the police because he punched in the glass in our front door while I was locked inside. So again, even though she says that he had gotten physical with her about one time, he had done other things physically, either punching things or yelling at her, screaming at her that she found abusive as well. She also said, in the first weeks and months, his explanation for his anger was that his first marriage had been very toxic, rooted in arguments, accusations, and manipulation, and he was carrying over from that relationship. He would say that he was so used to being treated this way by his ex-wife that he was projecting that onto me. That was his explanation. So he apparently didn't want to take responsibility for his own actions and decided to blame his previous wife for the fact that he was abusive to his second wife.
That's also one of the worst excuses I've ever heard. Since I used to yell at my ex-wife, I've decided to yell at you as well. But my ex-wife made me yell at her, so I'm now taking it out on you. Wow, you got to work on your excuses, man.
Now, the question of the third woman came up, so I wanted to address that as well, because a third woman who is not identified, who works in politics, apparently reached out to Porter's previous wives, both of them, and needed advice because apparently she was experiencing some abusive behavior that she was concerned about. I work in politics, and despite Rob's repeated abuse, some of which I think many know about, he continues to rise, and I'm afraid to go against him. I'm sorry to bother you. I wanted to reach out and hear your story if you are willing to share, as well as how you broke out of it with him and mostly how you recovered. She continued to say, Rob was abusive, degrading, a liar, and a cheater. And during the course of my relationship with him, I found out that he was to others too. I am just reaching out for someone who might be able to relate to the hell I have gone through. Now, again, we don't know who this third woman is. We don't know anything about her other than the fact that she reached out to his ex-wives to get some advice.
So Rob Porter has finally resigned, even though John Kelly didn't want him to and initially defended him. John Kelly is, of course, the chief of staff. So there's a couple of implications here. Look, the Daily Mail breaking the stories is weird. Not to say that they can't break any stories, but it's a strange place for these stories to be coming from. John Kelly has enemies within the White House. Rob Porter's a John Kelly ally. So might they be stoking these fires? Yes. Now, okay, but that doesn't affect whether they're actually true or not, right? And so now his supporters, who are all right-wingers, say, no, he's a swell guy. These don't look like stories you get out of a swell guy. Now, he can have his day in court, and if they pursue charges against him, then he'll have due process, and we'll figure out what actually happened. But in terms of the other part of this story is the fact that he didn't get security clearance because the FBI knew about this, and they had talked to his two wives about domestic abuse that he had in his past. And that is one of the things that blocks sometimes security clearance. But he's looking at the most top secret stuff we have as he's handing it to the president. He has access to all that information. And Chris Lu, who's a former cabinet secretary under President Obama, said this is further evidence of a non-existent vetting process in the White House. What happened to extreme vetting? They do extreme vetting of innocent people. And you've got to hear a guy who's beat his wife, apparently, according to allegations, has beat a couple of his wives and didn't even get a security clearance, and he's seeing top secret information.
Yeah, exactly. So for anyone who was livid about the fact that Hillary Clinton was using a private email server and was dealing with classified information in an insecure, unsecure way, well, consider the fact that we have an individual within the White House who had no security clearance looking at this highly classified information or material.
Could you imagine?
It's just, and
if
by the way,
in the Obama White House, they had a man who was accused of beating his wives. Let's make him black in this hypothetical. And he beat a couple of his wives, so he couldn't even get security clearance, but Obama's handing him top secret information every single day. It would have been the biggest scandal in Obama's White House. But you can say that with almost any Trump scandal.
So there's a little bit of a twist to this story, and I really want to share it with you guys because I do think it's relevant in terms of how you see Trump in this particular story. So Vanity Fair spoke to anonymous sources that essentially said that when Trump found out about what was going on, he was livid. Not just livid at Rob Porter or John Kelly, but livid at Hope Hicks. Because A, he apparently did not know that Rob Porter had this past, and B, the White House initially sent out a statement defending Rob Porter, and it was drafted by Hope Hicks, who's his head of communication, and she did not get the green light from Trump. So according to these sources who spoke to Vanity Fair, Trump was not happy about the fact that that was the statement released without his permission ahead of time. Also, another little bit of a twist, Hope Hicks is alleged to be dating Rob Porter. So it seems as though she might be protecting him by defending him in that statement.
Well, one last important twist. There are rumors, which we have not discussed before, but that are relevant to this story now, and that's why I bring it up, that Donald Trump is having an affair with Hope Hicks. So that might be another reason why he is furious at Hope Hicks for giving an unauthorized statement about Rob Porter. It might not be that he's mad about the statement. It might be that he's mad that she's defending someone else that she might be having an affair with. So it's an absolute mess. I don't know that Trump is actually doing that, and it seems, I feel terrible for Hope Hicks that rumor exists. I hope to God it's not true, and I have no idea if it is or not, but it would explain the level of anger that Trump has over this issue. Otherwise, I mean, Steve Wynn, one of his top donors, accused of this, sexual harassment, sexual assault. Trump doesn't care. Right. Roy Moore, accused of monstrous things. He doesn't care. All of a sudden, he cares about this?
Right, and I always go back to this phrase because it makes so much sense. The phrase that Anthony Scaramucci used when referring to the White House, the fish rots from the head down. And we knew exactly what type of person Trump was while he was campaigning. We knew exactly how he referred to women, how he poked fun at their weight, how he called them pigs, how he bragged about groping them without their consent. And now he has attracted, a cabinet full of deplorable men who have a disgusting history of being abusive to women. And so I'm not surprised by any of these allegations. And I don't care how reasonable people like John Kelly or Rob Porter seem relative to all the insane people within Trump's White House. They're all the same. It all depends on, how they act publicly and how they speak about certain issues publicly. But behind the scenes, their behavior speaks volumes.
What you just watched was one of the videos that we do today, but we actually do a whole 2-hour show every single day. It's a podcast. You could watch it in video or listen to it as audio. You can download it, you can stream it, and you get it completely ad-free if you could become a member of the Young Turks. TYTnetwork.com/join.